I was thinking about how to talk about my practice in light of everyone else speaking about their practice. And I thought, since I do have 7 days left at Creative Time, I would talk about a certain kind of political project that is called administration and what it means to work from inside a nonprofit as a form of cultural practice. Certainly, the backdrop of the Trump administration is ominous, but quite frankly, the political backdrop for some time has been rather ominous with different kind of permutations. I realize Trump is all the more freakish, but nevertheless, I would say a lot of what we have to talk about today certainly goes past the last year. The reason I also want to talk about this is because what I really like about each one of these artists is every one of them is very aware that art fits within a broader context of relationships of power. And also, unlike just kind of rhetorically trying to get things done in the world, they're very invested in a certain kind of dynamic relationship to public speech, to political mobilization, to actual pragmatic policy shifts, to also radical ideas of metaphor and meaning production. And they work on a different level. And I say that because in that kind of framing, I do think of cultural institutions as also operating within that in a different way, but certainly within the same kind of span of the production of meaning. When I got to Creative Time in 2007, I came from a place called Mass MoCA, and I was very terrified of working in public art because I knew it was very painful, and it was a lot more work, and generally, if it's a successful project, most people email you about how problematic it was. And frankly, public art is a place where most people like things because they debate it constantly, and it's a tough space. I feel like I've been boycotted about 6 times from numerous friends of mine over the course of my life. There, art and politics is a kind of mean-spirited life, and the internet hasn't exactly helped either. The internet's not this lovely place I imagined it to be. It's true. Like, everyone kind of emails in and it's really hostile and caustic. And then you meet them in person, they're like, hey, sorry about that. That's my email. I wish they'd say that's just my internet personality. Nevertheless, I would say what's interesting about a kind of project, when I first got to Creative Time, I was really interested in picking up the thread of projects, for example, that had happened at DIA, a series of lectures called the Democracy Project, a certain kind of work that happened out of the 80s with groups called Political Art Documentation and Distribution, Grand Fury, the work of Lucy Lepard, the work of Group Material and Critical Art Ensemble, a certain kind of left-wing critical practice that was very influential on me, and I wanted to somehow see if the kind of mandate, the remit of public art could pick up that thread. And certainly Creative Time had a history of that. You know, they had, the organization had put these Grand Fury billboards up on buses that were said, you know, kissing doesn't kill. I'm sure you're familiar with that series. So that was the kind of project. And some of the tools I found very interesting was one thing that I found important about working in New York, because I was very not invested in New York City, but one thing that New York City has, and I'm sure just like the Hirshhorn has, is it has a power to legitimate things. And legitimation is something that I think is interesting to think about as a function of cultural institutions. And I say that because, for example, and it just is a silly thing to say, but it's important, is if you put an artist in a show, I mean, this is basic, they might have more chances of getting jobs, right? Now, you might not think of that as a political practice, but it is interesting when you put people who really do not have a commercial gallery life into a kind of milieu that's used to kind of legitimating that. They suddenly are able to teach at universities. They go from adjunct to maybe a job. This kind of power is incredible and bizarre. And it's just because it has, you know, Creative Time would have the imprimatur of a New York City high-branded cultural organization. So that use, that power of like legitimating stuff, to me, I think is important to be very transparent about, right? Because I think cultural institutions have to acknowledge what they want to do with that power and be transparent about that, right? Because a lot of cultural institutions legitimate the power of people that already have lots of power. You know, like, if you're like, hey, I want to legitimate the power of Jeff Koons. Jeff Koons doesn't need you, you know? So we did this thing called the Creative Times Summit, and it was an interesting way of leveraging power. I want to be transparent about it because I think it's interesting. Like, yes, we would have someone like Okwuyen was there, and yes, we would have someone like Maria Lind there. We'd have, Alfredo Yar, like the platinum album of political art, right? But then we would have these like very aggressive anti-art world artists or young artists who are very skeptical of authorship, are invested in collectivity, that have practices that not only would not work in the commercial market, but also don't really work well in the kind of scenestery commercial or even kind of hip Whitney ISP market, if you will. So you could use this summit, which was a gathering of art and activists from around the world, as a way to slip in that. And while people would think, and everyone gets the same amount of time, but while people think the main stars, like the Alfredo Yars and the Okwuyen are the point, in many ways they are the way to produce legitimating social capital to mobilize towards other directions. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, it's cool. I say that because that is a function of what the arts can do. And there's other functions too. Certainly I'm sure we're all familiar with, there was a report that was done by Tom Finkelpearl's office at the DCA in New York around the demographic composition of cultural institutions. And it was basically just asking cultural institutions, like, what is your race, gender, class, I don't think class, like, what's your makeup, demographic makeup? And of course, we all know the figures came back that were like, it's a big old white world in New York City cultural institutions. It was not new news, particularly in the higher level jobs, right? But that is another power that institutions could have. Rather than being embarrassed by their numbers, what they should be is embracing the opportunity to demonstrate a different kind of work environment, legitimating different kind of cultural voices. For a field that's like entirely has rhetorically embraced postmodernity, infrastructurally, we're still like in 1933, wouldn't you say? And it's bizarre. It's bizarre. But I think that that's another kind of political power that institutions have. And another thing that I think is important is in terms of Creative Times practice. We looked over at the Queens Museum, where Tom Finkelpearl was at, and they did something that I thought was incredibly inspiring, and it's so basic. We all know a lot of museums kind of say, oh my God, we totally reach out to the community, but they just don't come in. I mean, our programming's diverse, but no one shows up. So the other way that Tom Finkelpearl thought about it was, why don't we hire community organizers on our staff, two, who literally just go out and get to know every different constituency in the community. They go out, they knock on doors, they say, hey, I'm with the Queens Museum, I'd love to know what your concerns are, what you're up to, talk to me. Because the Queens Museum's not going anywhere, neither is the neighborhoods. So why not get to know your neighbors? Rather than just doing programming that you think appeals to the neighborhood, literally leave the place and go talk to them. You could imagine, after 6 years of that, your relationship to the neighborhood is radically different. Radically. And it's only 2 staff positions. 2. There's museums that have spent decades agonizing over why their audience isn't different, but they won't pay for 2 staff positions. So, in terms of Creative Time, what we did was just steal that, but everyone should steal it. And we hired a community organizer on staff, so when we do projects, that the community engagement is a methodology that isn't just up to the artists. Because, we're going to talk about social engagement, but a lot of times institutions will put the entire bulk of the political work on the artist, and the artist is like, I only have so much time and energy. I could use a support team. And certainly on that front, I think it's more institutionally important that the institution has those relationships. So the artist isn't responsible for changing the demographic composition of the audience, or that the artist isn't responsible for reaching out to the community entirely. That those relationships already exist and they build on that. Now that is a political project of institutions that I think, in fact, learns from socially engaged art, right? That socially engaged art isn't something over there and the museums are over here. But in fact, museums can understand from that, and because museums and different kinds of infrastructures have actual capacity, resources, they can actually produce, far more than artists in general, unless they're represented by Hauser and Wirth. But in general, like the artists don't have as much resources as the museum, and they can actually mobilize a certain kind of radical pedagogy, a radical kind of cultural distribution of meaning into neighborhoods. I say all that because I think in some ways too, it's important to conflate or complicate the idea of the artist over here and the cultural institution over here. And furthermore, to just get it outside of the arts, there are other infrastructures that we can think of that with, whether it is government itself, whether it is policymakers, whether it is the military, whether it is advertising, that in fact all of these are structures that produce impacts in the world, whether consciously or not, mobilized and basically built up by different arrangements of resources. And when you think about the built landscape of the world in that light, and put socially engaged art in the conversation with that, I think we can have a much more fruitful way to talk about the political realities here of developing a certain kind of collective resistance that's not entirely about authorship, but is in fact about producing meaning together on the planet that deals with basic concepts of justice, equity, and complex narratives of audience and states of reception. That's what I have to say to begin it off. Now, each one of these artists is going to present a project. I think that was our ground rules, but they're going to, I know that Pedro's going to start with that whiteboard and a diagram, something, right? Yeah. But I'm hoping we can get into a fruitful conversation. And I also, the final thing I'd like to say is I do want to acknowledge that these can feel like dark political times, but I have a lot of confidence that art, it's not that I think art matters. I've already seen it. Artists were involved with Occupy Wall Street. Art is deeply involved with Black Lives Matter. Artists are deeply involved in Standing Rock. Artists have, and art in social movements is particularly important in this time, but it's not just it's abstractions. I mean, it's literally just happening. The question is not whether or not art matters to social movements. The real question is, can we coordinate enough to overthrow what have become deep inequities of power, like massive corruption that require a big, big, big team with a lot more discipline and coordination. And frankly, artists are like cats, trying to herd cats. It's like, Occupy Wall Street was great, but then you sat in those meetings with your hands going like this, and you're like, this is going to go nowhere. It can be deeply frustrating. Anyways, that's what I have to say to begin with, and then we'll get into a discussion. But please join me in welcoming the absolutely wonderful Pedro Reyes.
When we were discussing about what was to be our topic tonight, somewhat like discussing what are the limits of aesthetics and effectiveness in this so-called socially engaged art or social practice, etc. So I decided to try to test some projects in a chart that could be XY chart where one axis could be, let's say, art or aesthetics. And the other could be called usefulness or agency, no? Because when we do this kind of projects, usually there's an intention that beyond the aesthetic or within the aesthetic part of the project, there is something that is measurable that can translate into some kind of social or environmental or educational impact, no? So I was thinking about, like several pieces, how could they be qualified within those two parameters, because not everything that I do fits into it has a coefficient of usefulness. I do a lot of objects that are sculptures and that could be labeled as art for art's sake. So, like when I do that kind of sculptures that are just like stone carvings and things that end up in kind of collectors' houses, etc. Let's say that there's like a coefficient of aesthetics that if we have 0 here and we have 10 here, they may be between 6 and 10, no? So this could be like sculptures for art's sake. And that could be like where they are. They're not very useful, no? But then sometimes I have done some projects that are meant to have like a kind of a use, but I'm not sure how artful they are, no? For instance, I mean, like that's a kind of difficult to evaluate oneself, but for instance, thinking about climate change, I thought about the food industry. As you know, meat production is the main cause for carbon emissions and also what consumes most of our water in the world. So and in Mexico we eat crickets, it's very common. So I thought, what would be like the kind of a quintessential staple food is a hamburger. So I decided to do the cricket sandwich, no? Called the grasshopper. It's a hamburger, but instead of meat, it's made of crickets. So I thought this could be like kind of the panacea for the food industry, no? But so so maybe in my mind that is super useful, but a lot of people may not think that is art, and the interesting thing is that if we have here like a 0 to 10 thing, what I was thinking while just like testing this chart is that there are certain things that, let's say if we have here the 5, that if they have potential to be very useful, it stops matter. It stops. Is that an expression? Stops mattering? No. Yeah. Okay. If it's art or not, and that is very interesting, no? Tania Bruguera says that is like she's interested in when things, it's not so important if they're called art or not. So I thought maybe here starts to appear or emerge a territory of things that are interesting, or that people may respond to it even if they're not aware that it's art. I mean, for instance, like 3 weeks ago, I was in Chicago. I was invited by the School of the Art Institute to restage a project that was mentioned in the introduction, Palas por Pistolas. 10 years ago, what I did was to organize a campaign to collect weapons that was through a number of TV spots where people were invited to bring weapons to the city hall. They were traded for electric appliances, and those weapons were melted and made into shovels to plant trees. So we took 1,500 weapons and planted 1,500 trees. And I got this invitation. Obviously, when I did this, I was very much inspired by Joseph Beuys' 7,000 Oaks. And it was curious that, just recently, the School of the Art Institute tells me, we want to do a mashup of your project with Joseph Beuys' project. So we're going to take guns from Chicago, melt them, make shovels, and plant 7,000 trees. So it was like an interesting thing for me, because I never had been kind of invited in a curatorial context where my work was mixed with another work, but it sounded fine. No? If it happens to music songs where they mix 2 songs, I guess that can happen with art also. So that I think that that can be something that maybe is also in the like the idea that is replicated could be useful, and the fact that is like something that it doesn't matter so much authorship, and that can the nice thing is that people who have participated in this planting of trees made with shovels made from guns, the idea makes sense to them even if they are not literate, so to speak, in the terms of art, no? So that could be also something that is useful, but not so important what the aesthetics are. But then, what I was, for instance, yesterday I went with my wife and my son to a psychologist, and I was. Because my kid has had kind of nightmares for a year, and he cannot sleep. So my wife told me, well, let's try this. And I told her, well, this may be just a phase. I remember that I was having trouble sleeping at that same age when I was a kid. But anyway, we tried it, and we went to this first appointment. And I gave to the psychologist a book of a project I did called Sanatorium. And Sanatorium is a project that is a kind of a sort of pop-up clinic where you come and you have therapies. And I created these therapies also mixing elements from different schools of, Gestalt, psychodrama, hypnosis, etc., in a very free way, and it worked, and it went to 7 different cities. It kind of over 50,000 people participated in these 7 installments. So it was something that kind of empirically was successful. But what I realized giving this book to this professional psychologist was that I was doing something that I had no credentials to do. And that, that I was feeling, well, I don't know, he's gonna think that I am a dangerous person because, I'm practicing all these kind of ideas that I borrowed from psychology. And then I realized that there's something also here that is a kind of territory. This could be the sanatorium project, for instance. That is something that you can get away with it because it's art. If you don't call it art and you try to do it in the real world, you don't have such agency. So the fact that something is symbolic or that something is within the realm of aesthetics or creativity may open doors that otherwise may be forbidden. So I think that what is interesting is that that there are things that here this was a grasshopper. Yeah. And this was, for instance, the Palas por Pistolas, the guns into shovels, no? So the only thing that I am trying to reach here is that sometimes there are things that are, that work and that can work whether they are art or not. And then some other times there are things that because they are art, you can do, and otherwise they wouldn't be, they would be kind of off reach. For instance, actually, I was remembering a project that was called that amendment to the amendment, something that I started as an idea with Teresa Rose in Philadelphia, and then happened in Tampa, and now it's going to be restaged in Arizona. That is a rewriting of the Second Amendment. So in a workshop, you get like 200 people or so, and then you break the group in small groups of 10, and each group has like 10 minutes to rewrite the Second Amendment. So at the end, you pass around the microphone, and each group has written their own iteration of what the Second Amendment should be. So for instance, like that is something that I also believe that could be in like, the kind of art coefficient may be perhaps here. Sorry, the art coefficient is not very, I think that it can be symbolic or useful. I don't know exactly where would they fit. But the aesthetics are not so important, but it's still in this gray zone where that's a kind of magic agency that museums have for places, for experiments to happen. And that because it's an art project, then you can have that outreach and that call. That said, the interesting thing about like this part, which is the kind of art for art's sake, and that is not very useful, is like what allows me to feed my family. So I find that very useful. So like it may have like a kind of mirror, kind of. Thank you.
So, I was thinking about aesthetics, right, and efficacy and politics. And I was thinking about like how we all have needs, and some needs are political, and then we have rights, and then who provides for our needs, and our rights, needs, all these things that I always think about. And that our needs are provided either by a market economy or the public sector, and what can art do? So like if you're hungry, like a burrito might feed you, so you go to a place like this, and then it's cool. They're like, well, what would you like? Would you like guacamole, or how hot the salsa? And then they make it just for you, and then you eat it, and your needs are met. You're not hungry anymore. And then maybe you get a little sleepy after that, and you're like, I gotta wake up before I go to work, back with this huge burrito, and you need a coffee. And then you go to a place like this, and then you interact, and it's dialogical. It's like, do you want skim milk, or hemp milk, or whole milk, or big, or small, And then they make coffee just for you. Sometimes even it has your name. And then you wake up. And then maybe you need an identity. Who are you? Where do you belong? Like, what are you allowed to do? And then you go to the public sector. You go to the DMV, you stand in line, you take a number, and then they make an identity for you, and you're someone, and you belong, right? So we have all these needs, and we have mechanisms for meeting them. And then you fall in love. Oh my God, it's so exciting. And then you go to City Hall, and then, they marry you, and now your love is, whatever, in a contract, and you can pay taxes together and things like that. So it's great. So we have these mechanisms, but there's things that fall through the cracks. And maybe that's where art can come in. Like, for example, I made a piece with Nato, Key to the City. What if you want to award someone? You want to recognize them. You want to give them a kind of medal. So the Key to the City is something like that, right? It's a symbol that the mayor gives to someone. So Key to the City just tried to do two things. To change locks around New York City, so the Key to the City would come down from being a symbol and being actual. So it would open 24 sites around the city. Anything from like the gates of the George Washington Bridge to the gates to a little community market, to something in a church, to a cemetery, all over the city, all representing different kinds of public space. The second thing was to convince the mayor to devolve his power so it wouldn't be him, the only person who would be able to give it to someone famous. But in fact, so any citizen of the city could give it to whomever they wanted for whatever reason. So there's like lines and volunteers and people getting ready, and it's a true civic ceremony where you fill out your name, who you're giving it to, why, there's oath-taking. and then you get your key to the city. So art can make something like this, like a need that falls short. What if you want to lie? What about the need to lie? What need to tell the truth and tell the difference? It seems we're having a problem with that lately. So for example, you can create a work. Art maybe can intervene like this. So at the New Museum, there was a piece where a notary public could take something that you said that was not true, a lie, and notarize it so it could become a legal document that you could take to a court of law. So we were able to actually turn all your lies into truths, which seems to be something that we have a great need for. Of course, none of the lies could be longer than a tweet, because we know that lies must be able to be tweeted. So there was a legal process by which the words, the speech was transformed from lie to truth, and people gave us a penny that we would gold plate so you could pay with a gold coin. So it was a chemical transformation and also a legal transformation. And then we just posted them in the museum, and the museum was useful because most legal transactions need to be a public notice. You have to put in the newspaper, so we used the white walls of the museum as a place to put these truths up and their payment. And what about identity? Back to identity. The problem with a lot of the identity mechanisms we have is that we're bound by membership and biological imperatives that we might want to overcome. So would it be great if you could make your own identity? So one of the things we had was a system where if you were willing to let us photocopy as many of your identities on your wallet onto sticker paper, then there'd be a dialogical process where we would ask you questions as to what portrait you like best, how did you feel you belong, would you like to change your name, but all had to be crafted from your past identities until we made you a brand new identity that would let you into the museum for free. What about promising? One of the things about the social contract that keeps us together is that we must be able to make a promise, and that's what some people believe that that's what keeps language and society together. That if I say see you tomorrow, I mean it. That if I say I'll pay you back later, I mean it. So there was this project I did, I've done it 3 times now, where members of the public can make a promise, and the promise is published, and it's framed by promises that were made in public by people who are in the public, politicians, scientists, pharma companies. So then your promise is framed by other promises that were made within the last 24 hours. One by the Pope, by a Massachusetts law, French mayors, Iran, Venezuela, to make the promise, you would approach a table, you would state your promise, it would be typeset immediately with the other promises that were made in the public media. Then a contract would be made by making 2 copies, by making a rubbing, drawing/contract. And then you had to sign it either with blood or your name. 25% of the people chose to draw blood, and I was very surprised. And then we had different things that represented different ethical systems, and then you had to swear on whatever represented your values. And then the promise would go up, and then it would be displaced by the next person, except you kept your copy and I kept mine. And that's all I'm going to say for tonight. Thank you.
So most of us share the same goals for public safety: prevent victimization, support survivors of crime, and rehabilitate the people responsible for their harm. Yet many of our criminal justice policies increase victimization, disrespect survivors, and gravely damage people who have harmed others. History warns us about demonizing people in our legal system. In the punitive turn of the 1990s, we used shorthand terms to define people as horrible and irredeemable. So we didn't have to learn anything about their lives and circumstances: crack moms, super predators. These labels justified extreme punishments that now defy logic or common sense. For example, poor Black and brown women with cocaine charges we shamed and incarcerated, guised as concern for their children, who we cruelly called crack babies, who we orphaned. We now applaud programs that let moms keep their babies and recognize that addiction requires treatment. The worst of the worst was the name for supermax prisoners, kept in sensory deprivation for years, decades, without human contact. In 2011, UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Mendez, found that solitary confinement after 15 days is torture. In 2012, my governor, Pat Quinn, closed TAMS, the Illinois Supermax. Because these classifications provide false narratives about why crimes are committed and to whom, they fail to address the tremendous harm that comes from violence. We haven't undone these policies, far from it. You probably all know about super predators, mostly black youth, now middle-aged prisoners, trying one at a time to get resentencing hearings since the Supreme Court found their mandatory life sentences cruel and unusual. Who used that term, super predators, in the 90s? Hillary, and everyone else. Hillary had to atone for calling people super predators, but so should everyone alive in the 90s. It's really so much easier to regret the categories of the recent past than to consider the ones in the present that are still so appealing. What degrading terms should we reconsider now? Maybe the people we currently call predators, sex offenders. In Illinois, most people with sex offense convictions are labeled sexual predators for life. How is this determination made? Legislators simply pass bills to classify offenses as sexual predator. There's no criminal history consulted, no risk assessment, no evaluation, not even a definition of predator or predatory. It's nothing personal. Nearly everyone with any sex offense falls in this category. In fact, the police have a disclaimer on their site that says, legislators wanted this. We make no assumptions about these people and don't harass them. But the vast majority of people with any sex offender label won't reoffend and are doing their best to lead positive and productive lives. These laws proliferate because politicians use the issue on their campaign flyers for re-election. Everyone has to vote for these laws or risk a direct mail attack ad. This is a true crisis of lawmaking. I made these mantra cards to help legislators fight the urge to vote for them. I am a good legislator and I care about public policy. I look at the evidence, I look at the research, I'm smart on crime, I'm not a lemming. I don't have to vote yes on new sex offender laws just because everyone else is voting yes on new sex offender laws. Do these same legislators also craft policies for true public safety? No, they do not. You actually see this image a lot. It's a stock photo advertised as conceptual image of child abuse. And see the brown hands on her back? That's part of the concept. Legislators exploit sexual violence and racism for their re-elections. But we don't have to. Here are men labeled sexual predators. They're homeless at the police station because they have to re-register every week. They get there at dawn and wait hours. If they fail to register, it's a felony. My friend, a victim advocate, said, "This is what passes for rape prevention." It was a feminist insight that child abuse is an entrenched pattern inside family and social circles where it must be addressed. But this radical critique by feminists was hijacked by the national obsession on strangers. Most sex offenses come from people not on registries. Current laws miss the big picture of prevention. People must be held accountable, but reporting rates for sexual violence are very low. Why? Our system has so little to offer survivors that many would rather handle it on their own or do absolutely nothing than report. And all the laws and restrictions we pile on people with convictions are not based on evidence. Rather than reduce harm, they push people and their families into poverty, unemployment, housing insecurity, and social isolation. In Illinois, I've been organizing with families on all kinds of public conviction registries. DeMel is on the murder registry, for example. We're openly discussing the catastrophic consequences of these laws and inviting legislators to listen. So I'm going to play a little bit from Tom, who I will abruptly cut off.
I'm a little shorter, so, all right. There is no question that people should be accountable for their actions. Everyone in this room agrees that government should have fair and reasonable laws. Laws should be enforced and punishments should be just. The challenge is that some of our current laws, including the residency restrictions, destabilize and undermine people who are taking responsibility for their actions and abiding by our legal system. I'm on the registry. I accept responsibility for the crime I committed. I will always regret the poor choice that I made. I accepted my punishment and I actively engaged in treatment. I followed every law and restriction and put myself on a positive, productive path. When I was on probation, I experienced great stress in finding an apartment. Having lost my job and with few job prospects, given my offense, I had little money to afford rent, so my housing options were quite limited. Additionally, in accordance with Illinois law, I must only reside somewhere that is not located within 500 feet of a school, park, or playground. So I needed someplace cheap that fit those requirements. I searched tirelessly and discovered that regardless of location, most landlords in Chicago will not rent to people on the registry. I finally found a place in Auburn Gresham on the far south side. It met all the requirements and was approved by my probation officers. Things were finally starting to look up. 3 months later, however, my probation officers knocked on the door and informed me that a daycare license had been taken out near my residence and I had to move. They said, "You cannot be on the premises or you will be in violation of the law and your probation." The officers informed me that I had 1 hour to relocate to a verifiable location or I would go directly to jail. Now, imagine my confusion. I didn't understand. Just months ago, I'd submitted this very apartment for approval. I was told it was in accordance with the law, and I was given the green light by law enforcement on signing a lease. With only an hour and jail time looming over my head, I made frantic phone calls to friends and family, begging to stay with them. But no one wanted their address published on the online registry. All my family and friends turned me down. I had nowhere to go. I was panicked. I didn't have much, but what I had was all I had. I also had a year's lease on an apartment I couldn't stay at. Now I'd have to break the lease. My probation officers handed me a list of homeless shelters before they left. There was only one in the city which would accept a person on the registry. If there were no bed at that particular homeless shelter, then I would be forced to sleep on the streets.
My name is Carol.
Okay,
I'm
sorry,
a
we're gonna go
mother,
right to
an
Carol now.
advocate, and a caretaker of a 30-year-old young man with IDD. That is an intellectual and developmental disability, formerly called mentally retarded. I'm also co-founder of a national group called Legal Reform for the Intellectually and Developmentally Disabled. My son was 3 years old when he began special recreation and received services until he left high school with a certificate. We spent our whole lives advocating for his rights and making sure he was a contributing member of society. He was very vulnerable, and he was very easily persuaded, and he didn't know when anybody was telling him a lie. And all his teachers, psychologists, and his aides wrote reports saying that they feared someday he would be taken advantage of. That someday came in 2012 when a 22-year-old neighbor coerced him to participate in an act with an underage female. We also found out that this young man was also sexually molesting my son for a period of time. And my son was arrested right along with his own molester. We fought this in court for a year. Our attorneys feared that if we went to trial, my son could be persuaded to say anything that the prosecutor wanted him to say. So we resubmitted years of documentation, medical reports, school reports, doctor's reports, psychologist reports, risk assessments, and letters from family, friends, and neighbors. Why wouldn't the prosecutor consider my son as a victim? They offered a plea deal, one misdemeanor charge of exploitation of a minor, 2 years probation with an ankle bracelet, and 10 years on the registry. Our son could not survive in prison, so we had to accept the plea to keep our child out of jail where he would surely have been abused or perish. My son had to leave our home since the victim lived next door. He is incapable of living on his own. So on that day, I lost my son and my husband. My husband left to care for him. So my husband moved out, and we all followed the curfews for 2 years. We had to get him where he needed to be. We had to take him to register because he never knew when it was time to go. He is completely incapable of understanding any of the requirements. It is even confusing for us. The registry restrictions drag families down into fear, instability, and emotional distress. For me, it led to a road of anxiety meds, antidepressants, sleeping pills, and therapy. For my husband, it led to high blood pressure and depression. And for my son, he has health problems, depression, and his last 2 psychologist reports from 2015 and 16 show his IQ falling from isolation and no stimulation. He has lost his independence. He had a part-time small job cleaning tables he was let go of, and he cannot find another job. No one will hire him. He used to participate in special recreation and Special Olympics, and he has many gold medals that he is very proud of. That was the source of his happiness, and he is no longer able to participate in any of those activities now. Hence, he sits at home all day, isolated and alone. The financial toll on our family has been devastating. We spent over $150,000 of our retirement money and money for future care for our son on attorney's fees, court fees, probation fees, registration fees, and relocating my son and my husband. We all live with the isolation, fear, and the stigma that we are scum of the earth.
I want to thank my collaborators for being courageous enough to tell these stories that show what a travesty of public safety and justice these policies are. And I just also want to let you know that Will Gazzardi, the target of all those ads, is now my legislator. He won anyway, and he attended this forum on sex offender registries, and he's a fantastic, smart human being. And I just want to close by saying we shouldn't have policies we're afraid to talk about.
So maybe we can kick it off by, because you guys all have a range of practices, and it's interesting, the chart's helping me here. Because, we can almost maybe put our different projects on the chart. But before we get into this kind of conversation around aesthetics and efficacy, I was also wanted to just talk about with each of you where you see, where you find your work residing. Certainly, Laurie Jo, your project, this one, because this is, yours is probably the most in the kind of, it's clearly dealing with efficacy, but it's also in a lot of different terrains. Your audience is policymakers, families that are dealing with this, currently incarcerated people. So you wouldn't say this is like living within the art world, per se. And yet it's in conversation with projects that are artistic and using metaphor and kind of methodologies. Whereas I would say like Policy Pistolas is pretty in the arts. Well, it's a little vague too. Maybe we can each talk about where you find places to do these kind of works. Like where do you find efficacy and how does it interact with the art world and not? Or what does the arts infrastructure offer your practice?
I'll answer that really quickly because I have the slide up. This was an event at the Open Engagement Conference, which is the Socially Engaged Art Conference. This is the only event I've ever attended at that conference. But I just haven't happened to attend it before. But when they gave me the opportunity to do it, I actually knew that I could probably get a decent audience. And so that made me want to invite legislators. Because in a sense, I was able to make an event that would be a full crowd for legislators.
And they notice that kind of thing.
It matters.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but we did have huge problems figuring out where to have it because I was not going to have it in like a room with paint on the walls and that kind of thing. It had to be a policy event. It was also, it was funded by, partly or hugely, by the What is a Artistic Practice of Human Rights Summit at the University of Chicago. The short answer is the art world's been so helpful to the work I do. But it's always been a negotiation about what's the best combination of things so that it's truly useful to the policy work.
Sure. Like how does, so example, like I'm thinking of how you play with the arts and such.
Yeah.
Like what does the arts offer your practice? Certainly on your chart, we would say the getting money to your family to eat part certainly is helpful, right? But I'm also wondering, I don't mean that even dismissively, because frankly, like, I remember Critical Art Ensemble once said something like, I'll call it art if that's what the grant application asks for.
Yeah.
But I think it's okay to be transparent about just manipulating the arts for what you can get out of it. But I'm just curious too, because certainly in your kind of realm of utility too, there's also space where you might say the arts don't even matter at this point,
Yeah. I think that it has to do a little bit with what could be called the excess capacity that people have for engaging in, when you go to a march or you participate in some kind of civic life, often it's something that is not your job, but that you do because you have a concern, and you always also feel a little bit bad that you don't give more that you should. And for instance, like in my own case, I think that I often feel that I have an idea and I do a project that it could be like a kind of long commitment, and I have a little regret to know that for it to really make an indent in reality, I should keep doing that all day forever, and but at the same time, being an artist, you want to move into the next thing, and that's a little bit also a kind of paradox, because the Brazilian theater director Augusto Boal used to he used to have a name for something like that was called the Che Guevara Syndrome. And he used to explain that, for instance, Che Guevara goes with Fidel and does the revolution in Cuba in only 2 years. And he says I'm gonna keep doing this. It's amazing, I overthrow a regime, and he goes to Angola and almost get killed, and he goes to Bolivia and finally gets killed there. And Boal says, you have to be careful about how many revolutions you start, because you can end up like El Che. But but actually I'm saying two things. What I'm saying is that artists often launch an idea, but that idea has a kind of a certain life cycle. Yeah. But for instance, I don't want to become a food impresario and actually do my insect fast food chain
for the rest of your life.
So I know that it's a kind of we are kind of we produce certain ideas that hopefully somebody would steal, yeah. and then but you know what I'm trying to say?
Of course.
Yeah.
Artists often, sometimes I get artists always accused of not committing themselves long enough, right? So there's Rick Lowe who did Project Row Houses. He did it for, he's still doing it, so 20 years now or something. And then I say to young artists, they're like, what do I got to do a project for 20 years until it's legitimate? I'm like, well, you better hope it's a good idea. I'd hate for you to commit 20 years on a bad one. But just to say there is a certain kind of, often with political, people question like, what's your commitment? What's your investment? And it is tricky too, because certainly one can also be somewhat disingenuous about their commitment to certain kind of political things, or just be representational on a certain kind of politics. I want to switch gears a little bit because I was thinking also about, I would say, I do think there's been somewhat of a peculiar embrace of political art in the recent years, and I know it comes in waves, but I was like, we live in an era, of here we are with the Ai Weiwei show, Theaster Gates. I feel like everywhere I go, there's a hunger for certain particular artists that are like representing a certain kind of political meets social ecology, but it is a certain social engaged practice that's out there, and it's being embraced by institutions, which I don't have a problem. Some people think, what do you think of political art getting institutionalized? And then Shannon Jackson, this great professor at Berkeley, said, well, what if the US government institutionalized healthcare? Sometimes it's okay to institutionalize things. But it's interesting to me, if you think of like some political art, institutions think of it as like this as art. So Rickard Tirvenesian would cook pad thai, and then they'd say, cooking pad thai as art. But if Rickard Tirvenesian were to do cooking pad thai out in public, it'd be called man cooking pad thai. Mm-hmm. Right? Like it only works when it's in the museum, right? Like, whereas these kind of practices I'm interested because they work regardless if people know their art or not. Like Paul, when we did Key to the City, and people were like, oh, I get a key to the city. No one said, this is such an interesting art project.
Right.
They just said, they're giving out free stuff. And then they're like, what's it do? And then they're like, what? And they never, I'm wondering if that kind of, but it's interesting because I don't mean to be so pedantic and fetishizing institutions. I'm just interested in that space of when people think it's an art project or when they don't. Like, does the legislator, when he comes to your event, think, is he like the entire time bugged out? Like, I don't understand. Is this an art project I'm in? Or are they actually talking about policy changes?
Well, I think there's a lot. Stephen Wright talks about artists that lead a double life, and they're house painters, but they're really artists, but they have a house painting business. Yeah. That's more my mode. Yeah. I don't go lobbying and say, hi, I'm an artist. This is how I feel about criminal justice policy.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's because the chart is very useful, and I feel like art is like a material in my list, and sometimes sometimes art gets in the way, and sometimes art opens a door, and it's just like another tool that you have to use, and it's like I did a project in Honduras where we wrote. I'm from Honduras that has this is true. It has more governments than years of independence, so there's no history of Honduras, so to speak. So I made a project where there's like this event for 24 hours. People dictated as much as they knew through family lore. And the conceit was that we would write the history of Honduras in 24 hours. And that was able to be done because it was art, right? But then what happened during the event, well, that's how I got the money, that's how I got convinced people to do it. But then people came, and it was like a very serious project where people dictated really hardcore stories, also very light stories, and it just created a space where like imagination and reality all collide. I think Arjun Appadurai, who's amazing, he said that art can increase the archive of what's possible, right? Like that. But for me, it's important to not just be symbolic, but that there be some actual thing that really is happening, even if it's really small, So. Even if it's couched in humor and imagination, fun, but like actually something escapes the symbolic and becomes actual in the world.
I just want to add to that I think part of, for me, what is art about it is that we're all of us, but I'm talking about myself here, we're behaving in ways that are available because we're artists, and if people were behaving in their normal roles as nonprofit institutions or as legislators or as people on registries, we wouldn't be doing the things we're doing or forming the relationships we're forming. Sure. So like with TAM's Year 10, the project to reform and then close the Supermax prison, for example, we couldn't get certain civil liberties organizations to sign onto our bill to begin with. I mean, it was an issue that was just so hopeless that nobody would really either support us or take it up. And same with this issue, although with both issues, like there was a huge changing tide. But, you know, we're just sort of being an artist, you know, I mean, to me, part of the art is being, you know, of the world, but not in it. And having the sensibility to be able to not have the regular roles and kind of rearrange social relationships, reorganize what you're studying and how you're working together.
I mean, what is interesting is that there are like moments where also, I mean, like for something to progress, if it has to continue being art, can be an impediment. You know, like if you want to do more progress, then the kind of art can be something that is hindering the progress of an initiative. And in other moments, like it is precisely because it's art that there's like this kind of collective creativity and spontaneity and also playfulness that, so it's really ad hoc, no? There are moments where you can go places because it's called art, and places when you cannot like do more progress because it's like because, you know, like if it has to fit, you know, like someone's vision or etc., you know, like something may be embraced and then have a life of its own beyond the artist, no? And I think that is kind of it's difficult to do a general rule. It's really on case by case.
What do you?
Well, I was gonna say, like, for me, the perfect example always like here is Frank Moore, who was an amazing painter in New York and an activist, and in a way, he is the author of the AIDS ribbon, but it was really important for him to never reveal that, right, because that would get in the way of the ribbon being effective. So it's like the way that he hides, and it becomes an authorless weird thing that just happened, but there isn't. It's made by an artist. Is it art? I don't know, but it's made by an artist and very calculatingly. Not authoring it and not calling it art. And I always like to think of it as so effective that it almost self-destructs as an artwork, because now, you know, you can go to the website and there's like 150 colors of ribbons you can order. But it did its job, yeah, right? And in that territory is really interesting, where something could escape and just be taken by culture and spread. You know, like it could have happened to the grasshopper burgers, right? For example.
Wait, have you eaten a grass whopper?
Of course.
How is it?
It's delicious. It's better than the real food meat.
But I think that's a thing, right? There's places that have these maybe that's a Food Channel thing. There's insect restaurants, right?
Yes, but not hamburgers.
Your style. Anyways, thanks so much, Laurie Jo, Paul Ramírez Jonas, Pedro Reyes. Thank you.